Okay, so I used to work the overnight shift at a small hotel, and this whole thing went down about a year back. But I still can't get it out of my head because it genuinely shook me to my core. I still don't understand what that guy's intentions were or what he was actually planning. And honestly, just thinking about how long he was wandering around in there, while I had no clue he didn't belong there, makes my stomach turn. The hotel was tiny, 3 floors, maybe 40 rooms altogether. It wasn't a busy spot. On weeknights, we'd typically have somewhere between 10 and 15 rooms occupied. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was mostly slow and uneventful, which I didn't mind at all. I'd sit behind the front desk, handle some paperwork, occasionally check the camera feeds, or scroll YouTube on my phone when things were really dead. The lobby itself wasn't very large, just the desk, a seating area with a couch and a TV off to one side, and a vending machine set up in the corner. Behind the desk was a small office with a computer, a chair, and a glass window that let me see into the lobby while I sat back there. After midnight, the entrance doors locked automatically. If a guest wanted in, they had to buzz, and I'd hit a button to release the lock. Most nights after midnight, the only activity was the occasional late arriving guest. But one night, a man came through around 11 p.m., and everything about it still makes my stomach sink whenever I replay it. He buzzed the door and I let him in. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, tall, somewhat lean, wearing jeans and a baseball cap, with a backpack slung over his shoulder. He came up to the desk and asked whether we had any rooms available for the night. I said yes, told him the rate, and he nodded, pulling out a card. I ran it through, it approved, and I handed him a key card for room 214 on the second floor. Before walking away, he held eye contact with me for just a beat too long. This flat, expressionless stare that lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds after I passed him the card. Then he turned and headed for the elevator. Nothing about it screamed danger outright, but it was enough to put me on edge. I went back to my chair and spent some time on my phone. Around midnight, I glanced up, and he was back in the lobby. He didn't approach the desk. He just moved past me and settled into the lounge area, sat down on the couch facing the TV, which wasn't even turned on. I figured maybe he was restless and couldn't sleep. Guests occasionally hang out in the lobby at odd hours, so I didn't read too much into it at first. But then half an hour passed and I realized he was just sitting there, not looking at his phone, not reading, not even dozing, just staring straight ahead at a blank screen. At one point, I got up to grab something from the vending machine. As I crossed the lobby, I could feel his head turn. He tracked me the entire way. I didn't look at him directly, but I felt his gaze following me until I was back behind the desk. It left me with this uncomfortable, unsettled feeling. Around 1 a.m., I was going through the reservation system out of boredom when I noticed something off. I pulled up the list of currently occupied rooms, and room 214 showed as vacant. I muttered to myself and double-checked, because I had just checked this man in not even an hour ago. I thought maybe I'd entered something wrong, so I went into the check-in history, and there was absolutely nothing recorded. No name, no charge, nothing at all. I then pulled up the transactions screen to verify that his card had actually processed, and again, no record of any payment. I was completely baffled. I could have sworn I swiped the card and it beeped like it went through, but there was nothing in the system. That's when I picked up the phone and called room 214. It rang about 10 times with no answer. Then I checked the keycard access log, the system that records every time a door is opened, and it showed 0 activity. No one had entered that room, which meant he never actually went up there after I handed in the card. I looked over toward the lounge. He was still sitting there, staring at the dark TV screen. A heavy, sinking feeling settled in my chest. I sat there trying to decide what to do. Part of me thought maybe there'd been some kind of technical glitch, but the combination of no entry log and no payment made it pretty obvious he was never legitimately checked in. I watched him for another 15 minutes. Around 1:30, I walked over and asked if everything was all right. He turned to look at me, completely blank expression, and said he just couldn't sleep. Then he turned back to face the TV. I nodded and returned to my desk, but my hands were trembling. Around 2 a.m., I noticed he wasn't in the lounge anymore. My stomach dropped immediately. I scanned the lobby and couldn't spot him anywhere, until I caught movement near the far end of the hallway by the restrooms. He was standing there, half swallowed by the shadows, completely still. I kept stealing glances at him, pretending to be busy at the computer. He stayed in that spot for a while, then eventually wandered back and sat down in the lounge again, as if nothing had happened. I called my manager at home and walked her through everything. She sounded half asleep and told me to just keep watching him and to phone the police if he actually did something threatening. When I hung up, my thought was that it already felt threatening. I just didn't know what else to do. After that, I pulled up the security camera footage. On the first floor hallway camera, I could see him walking all the way to the end of the corridor, stopping there for several minutes, then doubling back. At another point, he stepped into the stairwell and stayed in there for nearly 10 minutes. I have no idea what he was doing in there. Every time I checked, he'd shifted locations, near the vending machines, by the elevators, once just lurking in a corner of the lobby where the lighting barely reached. And every time, he was staring. By 3:30 a.m., I couldn't handle it anymore. I called the non-emergency police line and explained that there was a man in the building who I was fairly certain wasn't a legitimate guest. They said they'd dispatch someone. While I waited, he moved again, this time closer to the desk. He was standing maybe 15 feet away, just watching me, barely blinking, not saying a word, just staring like he was studying every move I made. I kept pretending to type, but I was so frightened I could barely breathe. Around 3:50, the door buzzer went off, and I thought the police had arrived, but it was just another guest returning from somewhere late. I let him through quickly. The man turned his head and tracked the guest across the entire lobby, his eyes following him the whole way. That scared me on a different level, because it felt like he was observing him, cataloging him somehow. A few minutes later, he disappeared again. I checked the cameras and found him standing outside one of the guest room doors on the first floor, just standing there. That's when I dialed 911 directly. I told them there was a man outside a guest's room, and I had no idea what he was attempting to do. They said officers were already on their way. I kept my eyes fixed on the camera feed. He stood at that door for about 3 minutes, then slowly made his way back to the lobby. When he reappeared, he walked straight up to the desk and leaned over the counter. He looked right at me and asked if there was any food available. His voice was so quiet, it was unsettling. I pointed him to the vending machines. He gave a small, odd smile, then walked away. I sat there staring at the clock, silently begging for the officers to get there. Finally, around 4:10, 2 officers arrived. I let them in and pointed directly at him. He was back in the lounge, seated. They approached him, spoke with him for a few minutes, asked to see his ID, and asked him questions I couldn't make out from where I was standing. Then they walked him out. One of the officers came back over to explain. The man was not a guest at all. The credit card he'd handed me was stolen. He had no luggage, no reservation. He had simply used the fake check-in as a way to get access to the building. They charged him with trespassing and fraud related to the stolen card. After they left, I sat there shaking until my shift ended. Every time I looked at the cameras, I half expected to see him again. The part that really got under my skin was realizing he'd spent hours inside the building, wandering corridors, standing outside guest rooms, watching me from different corners of the lobby. And he was never supposed to be there at all. I still don't know what he intended to do, but I know, without any doubt, that it wasn't anything good. That was the most frightening night of my life. My name is Meredith. I'm 24 and I work nights at a tiny gas station sitting just off County Road 11. It's the kind of place people drive past without a second glance, unless their tank is nearly empty or they've taken a wrong turn somewhere. I took the position because it was calm and routine. I liked that about it, or I did anyway, until things changed. It started on a Thursday night, somewhere around 1 a.m. The air outside was heavy and damp, and the buzz of the overhead fluorescent lights had been grating on me all shift. I was just about to throw a cinnamon roll in the microwave, one I didn't even really want, when the door chimed. A man walked in, mid-40s, maybe older. He had on a green coat, his hair was disheveled, and his lips looked like they hadn't seen moisture in days. He didn't head toward the coffee station or the chip rack like most customers do. He just stopped near the counter and stared at me with this unsettling air of familiarity, like he knew me. "Hi," I said, forcing a polite smile. He said, "You always work this late?" I blinked. Yeah, mostly." He smiled. "I figured. I've come through here a few times. Noticed it's always you." That bothered me more than I let on. "Oh yeah, small town," I replied. He didn't leave. Then he said my name, Meredith, and I froze. I wasn't wearing a name tag. Before I could even ask how he knew, he pointed to the whiteboard behind me, where I had written that cinnamon coffee was back, and said I had nice handwriting. He said most people dot their I's with circles, but I used little diagonal slashes. He called it specific, thoughtful. I didn't say anything back. He didn't buy a single thing, just stood there for another minute looking at me like he was logging my reactions. Then he finally gave a small nod. "I'm Paul," he said. "Just curious, that's all." And then he walked out into the fog. After that, he started coming around, not on any predictable schedule, not consistently enough that I could point to it and say definitively something was wrong, but frequently enough that I stopped thinking it was random. Sometimes he'd come inside, other times he'd just park at the edge of the lot, headlights off, engine running. One night I tried to act like he wasn't there. He came in, bought a bottle of water, and lingered the way he always did. "You seem quieter tonight," he said. "Long shift," I muttered. He slowly scanned the store like he was making a mental inventory. Then he said it must get lonely being out there in the dark by myself, no one else for miles around. "I'm fine," I said. He leaned on the counter. "You ever get scared? Being a woman alone out here at night?" His voice wasn't threatening. That was the thing that made it so disturbing. It was completely neutral. Conversational, like he was asking about the weather. I stepped back and asked if there was anything else he needed. He tilted his head. "You always keep the back room door locked," he said. "Smart move. I've noticed you check it around 2 a.m. most nights." My stomach dropped. I didn't respond. "I'll let you get back to it," he said, with this soft, almost apologetic expression. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Then he walked out. After that night, I started walking to my car with my keys threaded between my fingers. I kept a tire iron behind the counter. I swapped out the curtains in my apartment. I started locking the bathroom door when I showered, even when I was the only one home. There were stretches where he didn't show up. Sometimes a full week would pass with no sign of him, but that didn't help. If anything, it made things worse because the uncertainty was its own kind of torment. I never knew when he'd walk through that door again. Then there was the Polaroid. I came back from a 10-minute break one night and found it sitting on the counter. It was a photo of me taken outside. I was refilling the windshield washer fluid dispenser behind the station. The shot was taken up close. Too close. There was no note with it, but the word "I" and the word "windshield" from the label on the bin had been circled in red ink, matching the same writing style he'd pointed out on my whiteboard. The next time he came in, I told him to leave. I told him that if he stayed, I was calling the police. He just nodded. "I understand," he said. "I've been too forward." "You've been following me," I said, and I hated that my voice cracked when I said it. "I just think you're the kind of person who's used to being misunderstood," he replied. "I thought maybe you'd appreciate someone who actually pays attention." "That's not paying attention. That's obsession," I told him. He didn't flinch. He just said, "Would it be better if he smiled more and brought a soda every time? Would he seem more normal if he talked about sports and pretended not to notice things? Like how my shoes are always a half size too big, or how my left eyelid twitches when I'm exhausted." I was already dialing 911 by then. He didn't try to stop me. He just stood there, arms at his sides, waiting. The officers arrived quickly. He didn't resist. They searched his car and found a notepad. It was filled with dates and times, my schedule, notes about my routes, descriptions of what I was wearing on different nights, details about my groceries. One page was just my name, written over and over, the letters getting tighter and smaller with each repetition, until they dissolved into scribbles. He kept telling the officers the same thing. He just noticed things. He was just a curious person. The restraining order came through that same week. I don't work nights anymore. I don't even live in the same town. The company moved me to a different location 2 hours away. But even now, when I'm driving home and a pair of headlights sits behind me for too long, I feel it. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck. And sometimes I still think about the way he said my name, like he'd already been rehearsing how it would sound. I want to get this out while it's still fresh because this happened to me literally last night. I worked the overnight shift at a 24-hour gas station. I'm 22, female, and I've been at this job for just under 2 months. I cover the weekend shifts, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. A coworker of mine, who I'll call Max for privacy reasons, handles the weekday overnights from Sunday through Wednesday. Last night, Max and a friend of his, I'll call the friend Ben, stopped in around 2:30 a.m. to grab coffee and hang out for a bit. Both of them had taken mushrooms a couple hours earlier. So when they showed up, they were giggling about everything and just being ridiculous. Honestly, it was the most entertainment I'd had all shift. We were just chatting about random things when Ben mentioned something. He said that before they even pulled into the lot, there was a car already sitting there, parked, lights off, but engine running, with someone inside. He said he'd walked up and asked the guy what was going on, and the guy claimed he was waiting for a DoorDash order. Under normal circumstances, that wouldn't be weird. Delivery drivers sometimes wait in the lot while an order gets sorted. But I hadn't received a single incoming order in nearly 2 hours. On top of that, I'd spent most of the shift in the back of the store cleaning, away from the registers and out of sight of the front windows, so I wouldn't have even known that car was out there. We kind of brushed it off. Max and Ben went outside to smoke and hang out with Max's dog, who they'd brought along with them. At first, I didn't think much of it, but once I was alone again, it started to feel off to me, especially since I had no idea how long that car had been parked there before they arrived. About an hour later, they came back in for more coffee. That's when Max told me more about what had been happening outside. He said that for the entire hour they were out there with the dog, the man in the car kept alternating between watching them and looking down at his phone like he was texting someone. When Ben, in his very elevated state, picked up on this, he walked straight over to the car and asked what was up and why the guy was staring at them. At first, the man pretended he didn't speak English. When that didn't hold up, he switched and said he must have the wrong address, then took off in a hurry. Max pointed out that the car looked brand new and had no license plates on it. He also noticed there was a mound of blankets in the back seat, enough to conceal a person underneath. What made it genuinely unsettling was what happened right as the first car left. Another car had just pulled into the lot, also brand new, also with no plates, also running without headlights on. The moment the first car started pulling out, the second one immediately followed it. They left together. Max stayed for another 15 minutes before heading out, but told me to stay alert and be careful. Then, around 6 a.m., he came back again, completely sober this time, and we talked through it more seriously. He said the guy had been acting sketchy the whole time, constantly checking his phone, watching them, watching the parking lot entrance, watching the doors to the store. Even Max admitted he'd been shaken by it. Once he came down and his head was clear, he wanted to come check on me. We both came to the same conclusion. If Max and Ben hadn't been there that night, things could have gone very differently. I carry a knife on me, but my gut says if there were multiple people involved, that might not have been enough. I work again tonight, and I'll post an update if anything happens. I really wish I didn't have an update, but I do. The car came back. It was around 3 a.m. I was mopping the floor when 4 guys came in to grab coffee and snacks. While I was ringing them up, one of them asked if I knew anything about the car parked at the far end of the lot, running, lights off. I asked him to describe it. He did. My heart sank. He told me they'd noticed it while they were pumping gas. It had been sitting there when they pulled in, and it just stayed there as they filled up. As they walked past it toward the doors, they'd been at the pump farthest from the entrance. They said they could hear a man inside, not yelling, but speaking loudly and gesturing toward the store. When one of them started walking toward the car to check if everything was all right, the guys inside finally noticed them, threw it in reverse, and drove off. I told them a car matching that exact description had been sitting in this same lot the previous night, behaving suspiciously. and when it was confronted, it panicked and left, with a second car following right behind it. They looked alarmed. Without me even having to ask, they offered to stick around for a while. We all agreed after about 20 minutes that it was probably safe. I thanked them and comped their coffee before they headed out. Nothing else happened for the rest of the shift, but I was on edge every single time I had to go outside to swap out the trash bags at the pumps. What scares me most isn't that I saw the car, because both nights I never actually saw it myself. It's that multiple separate groups of people felt unsettled enough to come in and warn me. The same vehicle, 2 nights in a row, around the same hour, parked specifically in a spot that's invisible from the register and the front windows. If that's not paranoia being justified, I don't know what is. I'm just grateful that both nights someone else happened to be there. My name is Daniel. I'm 29, and I work the overnight shift at a small rural motel, a family-owned place, not a chain, with 2 floors and around 25 rooms total. My hours are 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The motel doesn't see much activity after dark, maybe a couple of check-ins past midnight if someone's traveling through, but for the most part, it's completely still. That's actually what drew me to the job. I'm not really a social person, so spending the majority of my shift alone in a quiet building suits me just fine. The layout is straightforward. There's a main office at the front with the check-in desk, some chairs, a coffee station, and a brochure rack near the door. Behind the desk is a hallway leading to a back office that functions more like a staff lounge. A second desk, a couch, a mini fridge, and a wall-mounted TV. There's a speaker back there that chimes whenever someone rings the bell at the front desk, which means I can stay in the back, watch something on my laptop, rest on the couch, and just get up when I hear it. I've worked there long enough to know exactly how the building sounds. The frame settles and creaks, the heater ticks before it kicks on. The front door buzzes when a guest uses their key card after hours. Those are all familiar background sounds. But the thing about overnights is that even the ordinary stuff can start to mess with you if you let your mind wander. And sometimes the things that seem normal at first end up being anything but. This happened on a Tuesday night in the fall. Cold outside, maybe low 40s. The parking lot had 4 or 5 cars in it belonging to current guests, and nothing else. It was around 2 a.m. when I first heard the bell ring. I got up from the couch in the back and walked out into the main office. No one was there. The lobby was completely empty. I looked through the glass doors out at the lot. No cars pulling in, no headlights, no movement at all. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but the bell is distinctive and loud. I knew I hadn't. I stood there for a minute waiting to see if anyone came in late, but the lobby stayed quiet. So I went back to the lounge. I'd barely settled back onto the couch and picked up my phone when the bell rang again. I got up fast this time and went straight to the front, and again, nothing. Empty lobby, empty lot. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I went to the entrance doors and stepped outside, walked to the edge of the sidewalk, looked both directions down the road. Not a single sign of anyone out there. I went back inside and decided to stay at the front desk instead of retreating to the back. I figured maybe some drunk guest or their kid thought it'd be funny to mess with me. I sat there for 15 minutes without hearing anything. I started to loosen up a bit, leaned back in the chair, opened my laptop, Told myself it was just one of those weird, unexplainable things. Then the bell rang again. I snapped upright so fast my neck hurt. The lobby was empty. I got up and walked around from behind the desk to check every corner. Nobody. I checked both restrooms, went back outside. Nothing. I walked a lot with my phone flashlight. Silence. When I went back inside, I made a decision. Instead of going to the back room, I was going to sit right there at the front desk and wait. If someone was sneaking around and ringing the bell to mess with me, I wanted to see it happen. I turned the lobby lights down so the room was dim, and I just sat there, perfectly still, watching the bell on the counter in front of me. The quiet started doing things to my head. Every sound was amplified. The clock ticking on the wall seemed louder than it should have been. The mini fridge humming in the back room. The occasional creak from the building settling. I sat with my arms crossed, eyes fixed on that bell. 15 minutes. 20. My eyelids started to feel heavy. I started to wonder if maybe I'd been hearing things the whole time. Then it happened. A pale hand rose up from beneath the desk, from directly underneath where I was sitting, reached over the edge of the counter, and pressed the bell right in front of me. I launched out of the chair so fast it nearly toppled over, and I ran down the hall into the back office, slammed the door behind me, and through the lock. I stood there in the dark, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, trying to process what I'd just seen. Someone had been crouched under that desk, just feet away from me, the entire time I was sitting there. They'd been hiding in there, waiting. I forced myself to look at the security monitors. 4 feeds, one in the lobby, one in the hallway, 2 covering the parking lot. On the lobby feed, I could see the chair had tipped over when I bolted. The counter looked empty. Then, in the lower corner of the frame, movement. A head slowly emerged from behind the desk. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of it, and the faint gleam of eyes staring directly into the camera lens. I backed away from the monitor. I couldn't keep watching it. I grabbed my phone and called 911 with shaking hands, whispering to the dispatcher that someone had broken into the building and was hiding in the lobby. She told me to stay put, said officers were on their way. I made myself go back to the monitor. The figure had moved out from behind the desk and was now crawling on hands and knees toward the entrance. He stood up near the doors, tall, dark hoodie, hood pulled close around his face, posture hunched forward. He turned around and started moving around the lobby as though he was searching for something. Then he walked out of the frame, toward the hallway that led directly to where I was. I pressed my back flat against the locked door. A moment later, the door handle turned. Slowly. One single rotation. Then nothing. Complete silence. The dispatcher kept asking if I was safe. I couldn't answer for a few seconds. My throat had closed up entirely. Eventually, I heard footsteps moving away from the door. I went back to the monitor. He was in the lobby again, walking in slow circles. At one point, he stopped in front of the glass entrance doors and stood there, looking out at the parking lot like he was waiting for something or someone. Then he drifted over to the brochure rack and started flipping through the pamphlets, casual as anything, like he had all the time in the world. The minutes crawled. Then finally, through the parking lot cameras, I saw blue and red lights flashing. 2 squad cars pulled in. The man must have seen them too. He suddenly cut out of frame. A second later, I heard the front doors open. The officers swept the building. They found a large rock near the entrance, likely used to prop the door open, but they didn't find him inside. He was gone. They checked the lot, checked the road. The officer told me whoever it was must have slipped out the moment they saw the cruisers pull in. I kept turning it over in my mind afterward, the image of that hand appearing from beneath the desk, calm, deliberate, no rush at all. Now, every single time that bell rings during a night shift, I'm right back in that moment. I don't think I'll ever be able to look at that front desk the same way again. I have worked as a nurse in multiple hospitals across this state. I have held the hands of the dying. I have watched monitors flatline at 4 a.m. and felt nothing but a practiced professional calm settle over me like a second skin. I have walked fluorescent corridors alone in the deep hours of the night and whistled to myself, unbothered, unafraid. I want you to understand that before I tell you what happened. I want you to understand the kind of person I was. Grounded, rational, someone who rolled her eyes at ghost stories and slept with the lights off without a second thought. I am not that person anymore. The geriatric hospital sat 30 minutes from my house, a squat, aging building on the edge of a neighborhood that had slowly emptied around it over the decades. From the outside, it looked like every other institution of its kind. Flat roof, wide parking lot, windows that reflected sky without ever seeming to let light in. The kind of building that existed at the edge of your attention without ever demanding it. I had experience with older patients before this posting, so when I was assigned there, I arrived without nerves. I was practical, efficient, a person who believed that every unexplained thing had an explanation somewhere, waiting to be found. The hospital was short-staffed and behind on a dozen administrative tasks, and within my first week, I had already made myself useful in ways that went beyond my job description. I had been there only a few weeks when it happened. What I didn't know at the start of that particular shift, what I had no reason to suspect, was that it would be my second to last. That by the time the sun came up over that flat parking lot, I would be sitting in my car in the driveway of my own home, unable to go inside, staring at my phone as I typed words I never imagined typing to a head nurse I genuinely respected. I won't be coming back. I'm sorry. I can't explain it in a way that will make sense. I was running on what felt like negative hours of sleep. I had worked back-to-back shifts that week, the kind of grinding exhaustion that makes the world look slightly wrong, colors a little too bright, sounds arriving a half-second delayed, the sensation that you are watching yourself from just behind your own eyes. I told myself later that this explained everything. I repeated it like a prayer. It didn't hold. The Alzheimer's ward at night was its own particular universe. Daytime in that ward had a kind of gentle chaos to it. Visitors coming and going, activity coordinators leading simple exercises, the distant sound of a television playing game shows nobody was really watching. But at night, once the visitors left and the overhead lights dimmed to their after-hours glow, something shifted. The patients retreated deeper into themselves, deeper into whatever private landscape their minds had constructed in place of the present moment. It wasn't peaceful exactly. It was suspended, like walking through a space where time had decided to slow down and wait for something. Most of those patients adored me. Something about a young face in that ward, a person who belonged to the present day, who brought with her the smell of the outside world and a voice that hadn't yet gone hoarse from years of institutional quiet, seemed to act as an anchor. I could watch it happen in their eyes, a flicker of recognition, Not of me specifically, but of now, of the world still turning. I was managing several patients that night, checking vitals, adjusting medications, making the rounds with the quiet efficiency the graveyard shift demanded. But one patient kept pulling me back to her room, again and again, like a current I couldn't swim against. Her name was Lena. This was my first night assigned to her, and from the very first moment I stepped into her room and introduced myself, something about her made the small hairs on my arms stand up. Not because she was frightening, but because she wasn't. She was a small, white-haired woman with bird-thin wrists and eyes that caught the light strangely. And when I approached her bed, she reached out and gripped my wrist with both hands and held on, the way a person holds on when they are trying not to be swept away. "He's in the corner," she whispered. "The man dressed in black. He just stands there and watches." The corner she was looking at was empty. A curtain separated her bed from her roommate's. The other woman had asked for it drawn shut before my shift began, tired of the nighttime disturbances. Lena stared at that empty corner with a focused, unblinking attention that I recognized instinctively as different from ordinary confusion. This wasn't a woman lost in a memory or constructing a reality from the fog of her condition. This was a woman watching something hold perfectly still and waiting to see what it would do next. "There's no one there, Lena," I said, in the calm, even voice the job had trained into me. "You're safe. I'm right here with you." "He's smiling," she said, as if I hadn't spoken at all. "He's always smiling when he looks at me." I stayed with her for a while. I held her hands and spoke quietly, and talked her slowly back down from the ledge of whatever she was experiencing. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't want to disturb the woman behind the curtain, who slept like someone who had decided sleep was the only remaining act of defiance available to her. After perhaps 20 minutes, Lena's grip on my wrists loosened, and her breathing slowed, and something in her face went soft and resigned. She fell asleep with her head turned toward that corner. She did not stop watching it until the moment her eyes closed. By 11 o'clock, the ward had gone quiet. The particular silence of deep night in a hospital is not like any silence I have encountered elsewhere. It doesn't feel like an absence of sound. It feels, if I am being precise about it, like something actively holding its breath. Like the building itself is waiting. I made my rounds. I checked vitals. I sat at the nurse's station for a while and caught up on documentation and drank cold coffee and told myself I was fine. I was tired. Everything was ordinary. Around 1 in the morning, I went to the linen room to restock my cart. The linen room was small, barely large enough to turn around in, tucked at the end of a short corridor off the main ward hallway. No windows. One fluorescent tube overhead that buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious irritation. Metal shelving units on 3 walls, stacked with folded towels and sealed supply bags, and the particular antiseptic-smelling linens that hospitals seem to produce in endless, indistinguishable quantities. I pulled the door shut behind me. The sound of it latching was very loud in the silence. I began working through the cart methodically, pulling supplies from the shelves and arranging them the way I'd been taught. Largest items at the back, smaller at the front. Nothing that could tip or spill left unsecured. My mind was drifting the way it does during repetitive tasks on little sleep, skating along the surface of half-formed thoughts about nothing in particular. That's when I heard something move behind me. It was not a loud sound. It was barely a sound at all. More like a presence announcing itself, the way a room changes when someone enters it. A subtle shift in atmosphere, in air pressure, in the quality of the silence. I turned around. Nothing. The shelves, the door closed, the buzzing light, empty space containing only what it had contained when I walked in. I stood very still for several seconds, watching the room the way Lena had watched her corner, waiting for movement, for breath, for any indication that I wasn't alone. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. I turned back to the cart. I had almost convinced myself. I was reaching for another stack of towels, already rewriting the moment as nothing, as fatigue playing tricks, as the completely predictable result of being awake too long in a too quiet building. And then I felt the hand. It landed on my shoulder with a weight and deliberateness that obliterated every rational thought I had. Not a brush, not an accidental contact, a grip, large and firm and unmistakably intentional, the way a hand lands on a shoulder when someone wants to make absolutely certain you know they are there. The pressure of fingers, the specific, undeniable geometry of a human hand. I spun around so hard I sent supplies cascading off the nearest shelf, and the scream that came out of me was not a scream I recognized as mine. It came from somewhere below language, below thought, from whatever ancient part of the brain exists for exactly this purpose. There was no one there. I stood with my back pressed against the shelving unit, breathing in ragged, uneven pulls, staring at a room that contained nothing but towels and supplies and the buzzing of that light. I reached up and pressed my fingers against my own shoulder. I could still feel it, the phantom weight of that grip, as real and physical as anything I had ever experienced, like a bruise forming in the tissue beneath the skin. I forced myself to breathe. I forced myself to move. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway and looked in both directions. The corridor was empty. That sick, yellow institutional light stretched in both directions to the edge of visibility. Every door was closed. The ward breathed its suspended, waiting breath around me, and there was no one there. No one at all. I went back inside. I told myself sleep deprivation. I told myself the power of suggestion, Lena's voice planting images that my overtaxed brain was converting into sensation. I told myself every reasonable thing I could construct, and I held onto each explanation the way you hold onto a rope over open water. And I finished loading the cart. When the cart was full, I took one steadying breath, squared my shoulders, turned around to face the door, and prepared to leave. He was standing on the other side of the glass. I want to describe this carefully because I have relived it so many times that the details are carved into me. He was dressed entirely in black jacket, black beneath it, black that seemed to absorb the hallway light rather than reflect it. He was standing with his face positioned at the exact center of the small rectangular window in the door, as precisely as if he had measured the distance, as if he had been there before and knew exactly where to stand, so that whoever was inside would see him completely. He was not moving. He was not attempting to open the door. He was not doing anything at all except standing there, watching me, with a smile stretched across his face that was too wide, too still, too deliberate to belong to any expression I had ever seen on a human being. I don't know how long he had been standing there. I don't know how long I had been standing on my side of the door before I saw him. What I know is that in the moment I registered his face in that window, the world seemed to stop completely. And then I screamed. I screamed until the sound cracked out of me and filled the linen room and spilled into the hallway and reached every room in the ward, and patients who had been quietly asleep jolted awake, and monitors began alarming, and the entire night ward came lurching into sudden chaos. As I screamed, the face behind the glass disappeared. Not retreated, disappeared. The way something disappears when you blink, and it simply is no longer where it was. The door burst open, and one of my colleagues rushed in, found me against the shelves, and caught me before my legs finished giving way. "Did you see him?" I managed. It was barely a question. "The man in black, right there, at the door." She looked at the door. She looked at the empty hallway beyond it. She looked at me with an expression I will never forget. Not the expression of someone who thinks you're lying, but the far worse expression of someone who is genuinely uncertain whether you are still in contact with reality. "There's no one there," she said carefully. We checked every room in the ward. There is no one else here." Lena was awake when I reached her room. I could hear her before I reached the door. Not crying, not confused, but afraid with the kind of fear that has a specific, focused object. The kind of afraid that knows exactly what it's afraid of. "The voices," she was saying quietly to the room. "The voices are back. He brought them with him." I sat on the edge of her bed and took her hands. What I did next I cannot fully explain. I am not sure what compelled me, whether it was some instinct that had been forming all night beneath the surface of my awareness, or whether I simply needed to close the loop on something that had opened hours ago when she first told me about the corner. "Lena," I said, "the man you've been seeing, the one in black." I paused. My voice dropped lower than I intended. Was he smiling? The change that moved across her face was unlike anything I have witnessed in years of medical work. The confusion collapsed. The fog, the ever-present fog that had softened every expression she'd worn all night, simply lifted, cleanly and completely, like a curtain snapped aside. Her eyes met mine with a directness and clarity that was almost physically startling. She was present, fully, completely, unmistakably present, in a way she had not been for the entire 8 hours I had known her. For one suspended, terrible moment, she was not a patient lost in the drift of her condition. She was a woman who knew exactly where she was and exactly what was happening, and was absolutely, bone-deep, terrified of it. She stared at me, her eyebrows pulled together. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "How did you know that?" The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then she started screaming. Not the disoriented, frightened screaming of confusion, the raw, desperate screaming of someone who has been in danger for a very long time and has finally been believed, and that confirmation has made the danger more real rather than less. "Get me out of here! Get me out of here! He's coming now!" Other nurses came running. I was moved to a different ward. I sat in a plastic chair in a hallway for an hour, listening to the sound of Lena's screaming diminish slowly down the corridor. And I stared at my hands in my lap and felt something inside me quietly and permanently rearrange itself. No one found anyone that night. Security checked the building. They checked every room, every corridor, every stairwell and supply closet and exit. They reviewed what footage the cameras had managed to capture. Nothing. No one. I went home early. I sat in my driveway until the sky started to lighten at the edges. And then I typed my resignation into my phone and sent it before I could second-guess myself. I have thought about that night almost every day in the years since. I have thought about sleep deprivation and the biology of suggestion. I have thought about the power that a patient's fear can have on an exhausted mind. I have turned the events over and examined them from every rational angle available to me, and I have found every time that the explanations hold up for most of it. The hand on the shoulder, perhaps. The face at the glass, possibly. But there is one thing the explanations cannot reach. It is not the grip on my shoulder. It is not the face behind the glass. It is not even the way Lena screamed when I confirmed what she had already seen. It is the question she asked me in that moment of terrible clarity. How did you know? She had been seeing him for days before I arrived, nights on end, alone in that room, watching him stand in his corner with a smile that was too wide, watching him watch her, with only a drawn curtain and a ward full of sleeping strangers for company. Every night. No one believed her. No one took her seriously enough to ask a follow-up question. She was a patient with dementia in an Alzheimer's ward, which meant that everything she said dissolved into the category of symptom before it could become information. Until the night someone felt the hand on their shoulder and saw the face at the glass and came to a room and asked the right question. I wonder now, in the way I am not proud of but cannot stop, whether that is the whole shape of it, whether the believing was the point, whether something had been working its way through that ward for weeks, starting with the patient who couldn't tell anyone what she was seeing in a way that anyone would hear, and working its way toward the night when someone finally could. I have never been diagnosed with any psychiatric condition. I have never experienced hallucinations before or since. I know what sleep deprivation does to perception, and I know this was something beyond it. I know what I felt on my shoulder, and I know that Lena had already seen his face, and I know that she recognized the moment I described his smile, that she was no longer the only one. I hope that helped her somehow. I have spent a long time hoping that. But in my most honest moments, in the 3 a.m. quiet that never quite feels safe anymore, I think about the way her screaming started the instant she understood. And I wonder if being believed made any difference at all. I should warn you, this story makes me sound unreliable. In a small town, that's a permanent condition. People remember what car you drive, what time you get home. Strange things attached to names and don't wash off. I was 32 when it happened, living alone in a rental, working at a packaging warehouse. My life was steady in a way that probably sounds dull, and I was fine with that. Winter kept me indoors mostly. It gets dark early, and the cold settles into the walls of older houses. Mine was a single-floor place with low ceilings and a narrow hallway running from the living room to 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom. The kitchen sat off to the side, with a back door that opened onto a yard without a proper fence, something I always meant to fix. The heating was old but functional, and after it shut off, it made a ticking sound, like it was cooling in stages. I thought for a while that noise had something to do with what happened. I'm getting ahead of myself. The living room had one large front window facing the street. I kept the blinds half down at night, not fully closed. It was January, cold enough that the air inside felt dry even with the heat running. That evening, I came home around 4, microwaved leftovers, watched television I can't remember, and texted my sister. Nothing strange, no bad mood, no headache. I don't drink during the week, and I want to state that plainly because people always ask. That night, I'd had nothing except coffee and water. Around 9, I turned off the TV and washed my plate. Winter is quiet here. Even the neighborhood dogs go silent. The smell arrived in the kitchen gradually, or at least that's how I remember it. Sweet, but not sugary, not like cookies. More like perfume, but softer, almost warm. It reminded me of the old-fashioned powder my grandmother kept in her bathroom cabinet, but fresher. I didn't panic. I actually smiled. I assumed a neighbor was burning a candle and the scent had drifted through the vents, even though the houses aren't particularly close, and that doesn't quite make sense. I stood there a moment, just breathing it in. Then I heard something I still struggle to describe without sounding unhinged. It wasn't someone shouting from another room. It was more like the suggestion of a voice, close to my ear but external. A woman's voice, soft, like I'd walked into the middle of a conversation already underway. I couldn't make out full sentences. I caught fragments, or maybe I only think I did. It felt like someone saying my name in a tone that wasn't urgent, just familiar. I'm not even certain it was my name anymore. At the time, I had no doubt. I turned around immediately. The kitchen was empty. The smell seemed stronger, as if it had followed me when I moved. I walked slowly down the hallway, which isn't like me. I'm not the type to creep around my own house. I switched on the bedroom lights one by one. Nothing out of place. Windows closed, doors locked. I checked the bathroom, even pulled back the shower curtain, which I never do unless I'm actually about to shower. The voice didn't repeat itself clearly, but a low murmur persisted, like someone talking in the next room with the door shut. I was confused more than frightened. I kept looking for a practical explanation. Maybe the TV had switched back on. Maybe my phone was playing something. I checked both. TV off, phone silent on the coffee table. By then, the smell had filled the living room completely. It felt deliberate, and I know that sounds like I'm assigning intention to it. I'm not trying to. I only mean it wasn't faint anymore. It was strong enough to taste. Here is where things stop lining up. I remember picking up my car keys from the dish by the door. I remember thinking I needed fresh air, that the air inside felt too thick. That's all. I didn't feel compelled or forced. I just felt like I needed to step out. I put on my coat. I didn't put on gloves, which is strange. It was below freezing, and I'm normally careful about that. I don't remember locking the door behind me, though my sister confirmed later that it was locked when she checked. After that, nothing. No memory of walking to the car. No memory of starting it or driving. It isn't blurry, it's simply absent, like a section of tape cut cleanly out. The next thing I remember is opening my eyes to trees through my windshield. Still dark, but the angle of the streetlights was different. My car was parked on the shoulder of Route 17, where the highway curves near the woods. Engine off, keys in the ignition, turned back, seatbelt still on. I was slumped slightly to one side, and my first clear sensation was the cold. The interior of the car felt like a freezer. My breath fogged immediately. My nose was wet. I wiped it with the back of my hand and saw blood, dried in a thin line down to my lip. I tasted metal. My head didn't ache sharply. It was more like pressure behind the eyes. I didn't feel as though I'd been hit. The dashboard clock read 1:17 a.m. I had left the house around 9:30, 4 hours give or take. There were headlights behind me. A state trooper. Someone had called in a vehicle parked oddly on the shoulder. The officer kept his voice level, like he was trying not to startle me. He asked if I'd been drinking. I said no. He asked if I'd hit my head. I said I didn't think so. I told him the truth. I had no idea how I'd gotten there. I could see in his expression that he thought I was either lying or confused in a way that might become a larger problem. They took me to the hospital as a precaution. Blood sugar normal, no alcohol, no drugs. CT scan clear. The nosebleed had stopped on its own, and the doctor said cold air can trigger that, especially if the nasal lining is dry. He suggested I might have had a brief fainting spell or some kind of transient episode. That word, episode, the way he used it as a catch-all. When my sister picked me up, she kept looking at my face like she was searching for something different in it. I didn't feel different. I felt embarrassed. I kept apologizing for scaring her. She asked why I had driven all the way out there in the middle of the night. I told her about the smell and the voice, and even as I said it, I heard how it sounded. She didn't dismiss me. She nodded and said, "Maybe stress can do strange things." The police checked the area where my car had been found. No signs of anyone else nearby. No footprints in the snow near my doors except my own, from when I'd climbed out after waking up. The woods were untouched, just a thin layer of snow catching the headlights. People in town talked about it for a week or two. Sleepwalking came up, even though I've never done that. Seizures were hinted at. I had follow-up tests done. MRI normal. The neurologist told me the brain sometimes misfires in ways we don't fully understand. A few days later, I went back to the house. I stood in the kitchen where it had started, half expecting the smell to return, like it had been waiting. It didn't. The house felt ordinary. I checked under the sink for leaks or chemicals that might have caused some kind of reaction. I asked neighbors whether they'd burned candles or done anything unusual that night. No one had noticed anything strange. What bothers me most isn't the missing time. It's how calm I felt before I left. I wasn't panicked, wasn't confused. I felt almost invited. That's not quite the right word, but it's the closest I have. Like I'd been gently directed somewhere. I don't like saying that because it implies intention, and I have no proof of that. I try to stay with the facts. The smell had no clear source. I heard a voice I couldn't identify. I ended up parked near the woods with 4 hours gone and a nosebleed. That's all I can say for certain. It's been 5 years. I've never had another blackout. No one found an explanation that fit cleanly. The cabin wasn't somewhere remote or deep in wilderness, the way people picture when they hear that word. It was about 20 minutes outside the town where I grew up. Scattered houses out that way, some hunting properties, gravel roads that eventually stretched long enough between clearings that you could go a while without seeing anyone. The cabin had belonged to my uncle for years. After he moved out of state, the family shared it loosely. People used it for hunting season or to get away for a weekend. I'd been there plenty of times growing up, mostly during the day. That particular night, I was alone. I was 23 or 24, around that time. I'd just returned to town after working out of state for a while. A friend had suggested going up there to unwind. He backed out last minute because of work, but I already had the key and figured I'd go anyway. Being alone in the woods didn't bother me. Where I grew up, that was ordinary. I arrived in the early evening. The drive was exactly as I remembered. Occasional clearings where people had cut timber years ago. The trees closing back in on either side. The cabin sat in a small open patch with woods wrapping around three sides and a dirt driveway curving in front. I unlocked the door, brought in a cooler and a small bag, and did the usual things you do when you arrive somewhere as dark as coming. Checked the lights, confirmed the generator switch worked, opened a couple of windows because the inside smelled stale from sitting unused. For a few hours, I sat on the porch, watched the sky go dark, and listened to insects and frogs from the marshy area down the hill. At some point, I heated something quick on the stove and ate inside because the mosquitoes were getting aggressive. It was quieter than I expected. I stepped outside with a flashlight because I'd forgotten something in my truck. The cabin has no proper outdoor lighting, except one dim bulb above the door, so I always bring a small torch. As I walked down the short path toward the driveway, I heard what sounded like metal scraping dirt. The closest comparison I can make, like someone pushing something into the ground repeatedly. There's a large oak tree about 30 yards from the porch, slightly downhill toward the tree line. It's been there forever, standing apart from the rest of the trees that cluster farther back. The sound was coming from that direction. I wasn't sure I should look. That probably sounds odd, but when you're somewhere quiet at night and suddenly realize another person might be out there, it catches you off guard in a specific way. Eventually, curiosity won, and I raised the flashlight. I caught movement first. Then the beam found a figure crouched near the base of the oak, digging into the ground with what looked like a shovel or a short spade. I couldn't see the tool itself, but the sound of metal hitting dirt came every few seconds. He wasn't using a proper light. He had a phone on the ground beside him, flashlight side up, its screen casting a sideways glow across the soil. The longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. He wasn't wearing a shirt. The temperature had dropped by then, late enough that most people wouldn't be out there like that. He was digging in a way that looked rushed, almost frantic. Without really thinking, I raised my flashlight and pointed it directly at him. The beam hit his back and shoulders, and he froze. The sudden stillness shifted the phone on the ground, casting a strange sideways shadow across the hole he'd been digging. I remember how pale his skin looked in the light, and that his hands and forearms appeared darker, covered in something, dirt or something else. There was material smeared across his hands. I'm certain of that. Then he ran, fast, straight into the darker tree line behind the oak. He didn't grab the phone. I remember the screen staying on the ground for a moment after he disappeared, still shining sideways across the dirt. A few seconds later, he rushed back, snatched it up, and vanished into the woods again. The whole thing lasted less than 10 seconds. Something about his hands, when the light hit them, they looked wet, darkened in patches. At the time, I thought it might be blood. I can't say that with certainty. It could have been mud, but it didn't look like ordinary dirt. After a while, I walked slowly toward the oak tree. Part of me kept saying not to, but I went anyway. The The ground near the base had been heavily disturbed. The hole was larger than it had seemed from a distance, roughly the length of a person lying down, perhaps a little longer, and narrow. That comparison crept into my mind on its own, whether I wanted it or not. The soil around it was piled in loose clumps, the work of someone moving quickly. I shone my light down into it. The hole was deeper than I expected, though I didn't measure it. Nothing inside caught my attention, just dirt walls and darker soil near the bottom. Standing beside it gave me a feeling I can't explain well. It wasn't simply that someone had been digging on the property. It was how he'd run, and the fact that he'd been working there alone, in the dark, with only a phone for light. Whatever he was doing wasn't meant to be seen. I walked back to the cabin and locked the door. Then the back door, which I don't usually bother with when I'm out there alone. I checked the windows too. For the next hour, I tried to distract myself with my phone and the rest of the food I'd brought, but I kept listening for sounds outside. Around midnight, possibly a little after, I had most of the lights off and was sitting near the small table by the window. A shape stopped directly in front of the glass. Someone was standing there. The cabin windows aren't large, but they're low enough that a person standing close comes to face level with whoever is inside. I couldn't make out features. The outside was darker than the room, but I could see the outline of a head and shoulders. The person leaned slightly forward, the way someone does when they're trying to look through glass. I stayed completely still. My phone screen dimmed in my hand because I'd stopped touching it, and the room got darker. For several seconds, the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, close enough that it could probably see inside if the light caught the right angle. Then it stepped back. Footsteps crossed the porch boards, moving slowly toward the front door. The handle rattled, tested, the way someone checks whether something is locked. The footsteps moved away from the door and circled around the side of the cabin. I heard gravel crunching, then faint sounds near the back door. That handle moved too. I kept my eyes on the floor. I didn't want my silhouette visible in the windows. For several minutes, the person walked the perimeter. The boards creaked occasionally. Once, something brushed the wall near the corner. Then the sounds faded gradually toward the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night. Occasionally, I thought I heard distant movement outside, though it might have been animals. When morning finally lightened the windows, I felt steady enough to start packing. I didn't bother with breakfast. Before I left, I walked back to the oak tree. The hole was still there, mostly unchanged, though some of the loose dirt had been pushed partially back in, as if someone had started filling it and then quit. The edges were uneven, like the job had been abandoned halfway. I shone my flashlight inside even though daylight was filtering through the trees by then. Nothing visible, just disturbed ground. The whole situation had the feeling of something unfinished, a piece missing I couldn't locate. I got in the truck and drove away. A couple of family members heard the story later and suggested maybe it was a hunter burying animal remains. That explanation never quite settled for me, mostly because of how he'd reacted when my light hit him, and because he'd come back to the cabin after midnight. I was 16 when this happened. My sister Alina was younger, a gap that probably shapes how I remember things. We lived in a 2-story house. My father worked, my mother stayed home and did tailoring for neighbors. We'd been in that house for about 3 years. Nothing dramatic had ever occurred there before. It wasn't old in a haunted-looking way, just beige walls, tiled floors downstairs, 3 bedrooms upstairs, and a hallway that always felt darker than it should have, even in the daytime. I want to be clear that I thought that about the hallway long before anything happened. Dad left at 6:30 every morning and returned around 5. Mom would make breakfast, clean, sew. I walked Alina to the bus stop before catching mine from the next corner. Alina was small for her age and quiet. She liked drawing animals with enormous eyes, and she slept with the same faded yellow blanket she'd had since she was a baby. People asked later whether she'd changed before things started, became withdrawn, angry, started talking about imaginary friends. She hadn't. She was clingy in the ordinary way younger siblings are when they think you're more interesting than you are. The small things were easy to dismiss. The dining room lights flickered, but the wiring in that house wasn't perfect. Dad said it was loose connections and opened the switch panel one weekend. I remember him kneeling there with a screwdriver while Alina hovered too close, and he kept telling her to step back. The flickering stopped for a few days afterward, which felt like confirmation that it had been nothing. Then it started again. This time it spread. The hallway light would blink on and off slowly, like someone tapping the switch. My mother kept our bedroom doors closed at night, something about privacy and airflow. A few mornings in a row, I woke to find mine open. I assumed I'd left it that way in my sleep. Then Alina said hers had been open too, and she was strict about closing it because she was afraid of the dark. I told her she'd probably forgotten. She got defensive, which wasn't like her. She said she remembered the click of the latch. I thought it was odd that she'd paid attention to that specific detail. My mother began to look tired. She would stand in the kitchen staring at the stove as though trying to remember what she'd been about to do. One afternoon, I came home early. School was closed for some reason I can't recall, and found her at the table, holding the phone without dialing, just holding it. She said she'd heard footsteps upstairs while she was alone in the house, moving from one end of the hallway to the other. She'd gone up to check and found nothing. Windows closed, no sign of anyone. Dad didn't like that kind of talk. Houses make noise, he said. Wood expands, pipes shift. He was practical, and I think he felt that admitting something else might be happening would mean he'd failed to protect us. But when the kitchen cabinet door slammed shut on its own, hard enough to rattle the plates on the table, while all 4 of us were sitting there, he went quiet. Alina flinched so badly she knocked over her glass of water. My mother suggested having a priest come to bless the house. We weren't deeply religious, but we'd grown up attending church on holidays and important occasions, so calling one didn't feel out of place. She contacted the local parish, and a priest agreed to come on a Saturday afternoon. I was embarrassed by the whole thing, worried the neighbors would see and think we'd lost our minds. I stayed upstairs while he was there, but I could hear him murmuring prayers and moving room to room, carrying a small container of holy water he'd flick lightly against the walls. I leaned over the banister at one point and saw him in the living room, my mother standing stiffly behind him. Then they moved upstairs. He stepped into my room, then the bathroom, then Alina's room at the end of the hall. I wasn't inside, but I was close enough to see his face when he came back out. He looked different, not frightened. It was more like someone had told him something that didn't add up. His skin had gone pale. He wiped his forehead, though it wasn't warm. He asked Alina a few questions in a quiet voice, whether she'd been feeling unwell, whether she'd been having bad dreams. She nodded and looked confused. When he turned back toward the doorway of her room, he hesitated. That hesitation is what stays with me. He didn't step back inside. He turned to my parents and said he would say one more prayer downstairs. He did, quickly, and then packed his things. My mother asked if everything was all right. He said, "Continue to pray. Keep the family close." He left before sunset without completing the blessing. That night, things changed in a way that's harder to talk about. Around midnight, I woke to a heavy thud from the hallway. Not the sound of something falling, heavier than that. My door was open again, and the hallway light was on, though we'd turned it off before bed. I stepped out and saw Lena standing at the top of the stairs, swaying slightly, the way someone sways when they're sleepwalking. Her nightgown had dark stains across the front. It looked like blood. I rushed to her and grabbed her shoulders. She blinked at me slowly, as if trying to focus. My mother came running up behind me and gasped and pulled Alina into the bathroom. We checked her arms, her legs, her scalp. There was no cut, no scratch, no dried blood on her skin. The stains were only on the fabric. Dad checked the stairs, the hallway, the bathroom floor for signs of a fall. Nothing. No source. My hands were shaking as I held the edge of the sink. I've gone back over it and thought maybe I missed something obvious. Maybe she'd had a nosebleed and wiped it away. But there was nothing on her face. And the stains were lower, across her chest and stomach. We took her to the hospital anyway, because she started complaining of stomach pain. By the time we arrived, she was feverish and quiet. They kept her overnight for observation. My parents stayed with her. I went back with my uncle, who had come to help. The next morning, I went upstairs to get some clothes for my mother. Alina's room felt colder than the rest of the house. I know how that sounds, like I'm manufacturing atmosphere. I'm not. The window was closed. The air was still. Her bed was unmade from the night before, the yellow blanket half on the floor. Something was sitting on the edge of her bed. It looked like a woman, but distorted, as if the face had been stretched unevenly in different directions. The mouth seemed too wide, the eyes didn't align correctly, like something slightly blurred. But I knew it wasn't a shadow. It was darker than the room and somehow separate from it. I froze. It turned its head toward me. The movement was wrong, like a video running at the wrong speed. I felt heavy pressure in my chest. Then it was gone. I even stepped closer to the bed, like I might catch it doing something again. Eventually, I grabbed the clothes I'd come for and left, pulling the door shut behind me harder than I meant to. Alina was discharged 2 days later. Her fever had broken. The doctors found nothing seriously wrong. She seemed tired, but otherwise normal for about a week. Then she got sick again, and this time it was worse. She woke up screaming about a woman sitting on her bed, watching her sleep. My parents exchanged a look that I still think about. She developed bruises on her arms. Doctors suggested she might have been bumping into things, but the location of them didn't make sense. They were clustered in a way that felt deliberate. I don't want to overstate that, but they were. My parents began looking for another house almost immediately. They didn't discuss it openly, but I could hear the conversations through the thin walls at night. We moved out within a few months. It felt rushed. Some furniture was left behind because there hadn't been time to sell it. Alina improved after we moved, gradually. The fever stopped. She slept through the night again. The bruises faded and didn't come back. We never spoke about the distorted woman. I tried once, and my mother told me not to fill my head with things that weren't helpful. Dad said stress can make you see things. I've driven past that house a few times over the years. It's still standing, but no one lives there. The yard is overgrown, the windows boarded. I don't know if that's connected to what happened or simply because the market is bad. Houses get abandoned all the time. I try not to make it into something symbolic. Alina is in her late 20s now. She doesn't remember much about that year, only that she felt watched. Sometimes she jokes about being the haunted child of the family, but lightly, like she's testing how serious it really was. What I replay most isn't the figure on the bed. It's the priest's face when he stepped out of her room. The way he didn't go back in. A grown man deciding not to continue. Whatever was in that house, if it was something at all and not simply our minds under pressure, seemed to grow angrier after that day. I don't have an explanation for the blood on her nightgown or the thing I saw sitting on the edge of her bed. I'm not sure I'm meant to.